All right. Welcome everyone to the 20th Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. The meeting for August 2023. It's a pleasure to see many familiar faces and a few new participants as well who are joining us for the first time. I have the pleasure of hosting today for this month Jesper Johnsøn from the OECD, who has been responsible for really great work in terms of measuring not corruption, but the opposite side of the coin, which is public integrity. And I'm sure we'll have also questions about how that connects to other measurements that target rather the bad part of the equation. So I'm very excited to hear him present their latest results. Before I invite him to start sharing his presentation, just some general rules about how the meeting will be conducted. The meeting will last about 90 minutes. Participants are welcome to ask questions or make comments at any given point during the presentation. So if you would like to participate, just please raise your hand and I will invite you to unmute yourself. In my experience, that makes for a very interesting dynamic and debate during these meetings. Other than that, please, I will ask you to remain muted. Even if you have to go out and come back, just make sure that your microphone remains muted, so not to disrupt the flow of the presentation. This meeting is being recorded. This is the second month in which these meetings are being recorded, and it will be uploaded to YouTube and shared on social media and the website of the Japan Network of Anti-Corruption Researchers in about a month's time. We just started doing this, as you probably have noticed, the time is almost impossible for our colleagues from the Americas to join. So after hearing many protests from their side, we decided to start recording them. Other than that, we also are joined by Ms. Raisi Barath, who is an undergrad in the university where I teach, and she will be taking notes and prepare a report meeting that will be shared with you all in a few weeks' time. Other than that, that's pretty much it, I believe. I hope for a very interesting discussion, a friendly conversation about the OECD Public Integrity Indicators and how it relates to other areas of measuring corruption that you may specialize in or you may be aware of. Okay, of course, I am Joseph Poshgai. I will be your host today. When you wish to ask any questions or make any comments, I will also ask you to please introduce yourself very briefly. What is your affiliation? What is your area of expertise? And anything else you would like to share with the rest of the group? As one of the things that I try to encourage here is for some form of a little bit of networking to see if we can also incentivize collaboration moving forward. Okay, so I don't want to take any more of your time. Jesper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure. This is my first presentation after the summer holidays, after my summer holidays. So I might be still a bit rusty. But I think it's also a great then opportunity to have a more informal discussions with peers on this, and of course to present this work, which hopefully everyone will soon know about. So I don't know everyone, I know a few people. So maybe before we start, a little bit about me. So it also makes it easier for you to ask questions later. I guess one success indicator of this virtual seminar would be if everyone has at least one question at the end. So you can grab your notebook, virtual or manual, and as we move through, jot down what could be interesting. And knowing a bit about me might make it easier to come up with a good question. So I've worked for the OECD the past 8 years, and at least half of those has been focused on developing this set of indicators. So far, it's been more internally focused. Now we're opening up much more for the outside world, and we'll get back to that, how we're going to engage much more with the academic world, with civil society, now that we actually have data to share, and quite a lot actually now, and more coming. before my first journey at the OECD, I worked on another set of indicators that related to broader public governance. It's for the Sigma program, focused on EU enlargement countries, and there are many similarities in terms of methodology between these two sets of indicators. But before that, I worked for the Michelsen Institute in Norway, where there is a little unit called U4, and I set up the evaluation and measurement theme there, which is still going strong, which is very great. And I still think many people use that as a resource. And one of the blog posts that I'm too late writing would be about how a lot of the thoughts from back then have come to fruition now, which is great. So a lot of the original kind of aspirations when we started that work, advising governments, but also advising bilateral aid donors, which is the U4 main clients, about first, it was very focused on providing guidance on what type of indices to use, what type of indicators to use for what contexts, which ones are good for what, etc. Then we at U4 started thinking a little bit through how could we be an incubator for new exciting ideas. That was, if anyone remembers, the Proxy challenge. And then I did a lot of evaluations of specific country programs and specific anti-corruption programs. I kind of took that with me to the OECD. And by that time, I'd written quite a lot of papers, and they're probably getting old by now, but a lot of kind of guidance on what is important, how should we be doing it. But if you go back 10, 20 years, the conclusion is more or less always the same, that we need more and better data. So there's some progress in terms of methods. There's some new methods that are very exciting, but most of them are really untapped because we just don't have a lot of data in this field. So it was really kind of great that I landed in a spot at the OECD where they actually started this journey, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. So a little presentation first to give you an overview, get you kind of caught up on what we've been doing the last many years. Then I have some videos which we prepared for the last Global Anti-Corruption Forum in Paris. If you've already seen them, I'm sorry, but maybe some of you have not seen them, and they present in a much better way than me kind of the highlights of what the data actually shows. So I will share my screen, and I'll try and do it like this. And Joseph, if you can just say that you see the slide or not. Not yet.
Not yet, no. Okay.
What about now? It's good now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So, very simple agenda. I will give you an introduction into what these indicators are, but also a little bit of background. So why we developed these new indicators. Then we can start talking about, this will be more on a Q&A basis. I didn't do like any slides on it, but how do you perceive they're different? How do I perceive they're different from other indices? I think that's an interesting discussion. And then I hope we can also talk about, and I can give some examples of how they can lead to positive change. That was one of the big changes from moving from an academic institution to the OECD, is that, you know, data for the sake of data is good, but always that whenever you work on something, it should ideally lead to positive changes in the way that member countries behave. So the indicators are very much designed to promote that. A big picture in terms of what the OECD Public Sector Integrity Division is actually doing. So we're an intergovernmental organization. We set standards which is very useful also when you work on measurement, because that gives you the normative framework that you measure against. You don't have to invent from scratch what is good public integrity, what is bad corruption. You can actually anchor it in something that was already agreed by the member countries. The main frame for the whole set of indicators is the Council recommendation on public integrity from 2017. But we also have a range of other recommendations, and we have a new lobbying recommendation coming, which will probably lead to an update also on the set of indicators around lobbying, just actually expanding them. So OECD is also a forum for a policy dialogue. So my main committee, where the indicators were born, is what we call the Working Party of Senior Public Integrity Officials. So this is where all OECD member countries, they will send one or several delegates, typically from an anti-corruption body, from the Ministry of Justice, from the Ministry of Interior. We also have representatives from Supreme Audit institutions, lobby authorities, if they exist. So these national representatives, they sit around the table. Out of those 38, we drew a subset of those particularly interested and knowledgeable, a task force that helped us produce these indicators. So this was around 9 member countries that really invested a lot and took a lot of extra work on them to help be a sounding board for us, help guide us in terms of whether these indicators were realistic, whether they would actually work in the different country contexts. This is the most difficult part of my job, is to come up with a set of universal indicators that will work in very, very different governance contexts. And even within the OECD, the governance contexts are quite different, and the size of the countries are quite different, etc. So moving on from that, and where the indicators more specifically fit, is our work on evidence generation and doing conceptual and comparative analysis. And the public integrity indicators is the first cross-country data set that is based on agreed standard indicators on public integrity and anti-corruption by an international organization. So we actually went through the whole committee work. So very much like other OECD data sets that you would download, that you will fully trust when you download it from the OECD statistical database. This is born in the same way, in the same spirit of going through that quite tedious and long and cumbersome committee procedure. But it is like in academia that all of that work actually brings some, not just quality with it, but also legitimacy with it. We do a lot of different thematic reports, and more these indicators are starting to feed into that as the kind of evidence backbone. But of course, there's a lot of other more analytic, more qualitative sources of evidence, other ad hoc surveys that would feed into these, but a lot of focus on democracy right now, a lot of focus on tech, a lot of focus on different analytical methods. As I said, lobbying, but also about other types of corruption than bribery. We talked about lobbying, but also broader in terms of policy capture and what we would call undue influence, behavioral insights, and the current set of indicators we are finalizing, I'll get back to that, is on audit, where we also have quite a nice, strong, good team internally. As a complement to that, we also do kind of in-depth country integrity reviews, which are downloadable on the web, so different country programs. So more specifically on these indicators, so why 4 or 5 years ago did OECD member countries decide to actually develop this new set? There are several reasons, and they're all kind of interrelated. Many of you will know some of the reasons here. I mean, one was about providing a credible alternative to the existing indicators. So most of the existing indicators that say, policymakers, practitioners would know are the Corruption Perception Index, the World Bank Worldwide Governance Indicators, which works very well and worked very well when they were born in terms of providing a lot of good advocacy for making sure that everyone paid attention to the corruption problem. But if you are, let's say, someone who is tasked with then solving the problem, it doesn't really give you a lot of good information in terms of what is actually wrong where and how do I fix it. So that was the alternative. So we're not trying to actually compete with these existing indices. We're trying to do something that's quite different from that. All the way again back to my U4 days, that was where we started, like analyzing and criticizing the existing indices. And there's been a lot written about that. And I think we tried to take all of these insights into how these new indicators were designed. Of course, I think one distinct difference is that these indicators were not born and are not directly targeting academia or civil society. They were first and foremost born and targeting government needs. In terms of what would be the dashboard that you would need in terms of good data, actionable data if you were a policymaker in a national administration. What do you have? And there was a big gap there, and that was the gap we were trying to fill. So another difference is that whenever we have a criteria in our methodology, I will show you what that is later. It's always grounded in an agreed legal standard, either by the OECD or by a UN body, or in some cases we use Greco standards, even if it's a regional body. It's gone through the task force, it's been validated by the Senior Public Integrity Officials Committee. And this is if you go back to some of the literature, for example, in this very, very good publication by one of my close colleagues on uses and abuses of governance indicators. This is one of the problems often with indicators out there, is that you could relate to the doing business example again. Without that kind of normative grounding indicators, they will tend to even if they're technical and they're meant to just measure what was actually a solid construct, because we have a lack of solid constructs, they will change quite a lot over time and sometimes be politically driven. And at least here, it's quite clear what we're measuring against, and it's very difficult for countries to say they do not agree because they already signed up to these standards. So that is one kind of key characteristic of what we did. Of course, that took quite a long time to do. I think thirdly is our insistence on drawing on primary data. This is what we're good at. This is what makes us different. This is what makes it a long process to collect all this data, to validate it. Yeah, that was kind of the gap. There are many variants of the indices that rely on secondary. I mentioned two before, the Corruption Perception Index and the Worldwide Governance Indicators, but there are many other variants nowadays. I mean, they mushroomed over the last 10 years that are quite similar in terms of methodology, drawing on various secondary data sources of varying quality and then mashed together, and then somehow expecting that because you mash all this different secondary data together, it will give a reliable picture of a country. And if you've tried, like me, for example, I have been one of the so-called experts that have been asked to rank on an ordinal scale Denmark on for various instruments. This is really, really, really difficult, and you often feel that I cannot maybe answer this question, but there's not even a do not know answer option. So you're forced to come out with your kind of opinion on this, and that is then all meshed up in the end. And you cannot even very often find that underlying data with these indices. So I think that's a problem. So we went all the way back to kind of solid, basic social science stuff, drawing on primary data from governments. Also here, the OECD is quite unique because we actually have these standing networks established, as I said, through the working party. So we have direct contact with those data holders in the administrations. So for the last data collection, we were actually directly in contact with the election commissions, the lobby authorities, as I said, of course, the ministries of justice or interior, depending on who is responsible for that policy area in the country. And we would go directly to the sources of parliamentary websites to do that. I will talk a little bit more later, give you an example of what I mean with mixed methods and triangulating data sources. That was a kind of fundamental build concept. And where possible, of course, trying to take advantage of some of the more exciting advantages of the big data analytics, machine learning. We use a lot of semantic analysis in our approach. It all depends on what is the indicator and how it lends itself to using these different methods. Finally, what is the hallmark of any international organization? What we're good at is to try and harmonize different legal definitions, different definitions of different measures. So harmonizing the different administrative data sets and surveys across the membership, that's a long process. But I can give you a few examples of where we started doing that. And I think that's really in the long term, the most important if you want to have better data in this area is slowly that countries see benefits of starting to, one, publish the data and two, harmonize that data. Then we do a lot of work on spreading good examples of key performance indicators from one country to the whole OECD membership. So for example, when we needed to come up with an outcome level measure and not just a process level measure of the impact of supreme audit institutions. There are some good ones already, like implementation rates. Here, again, the problem is harmonization. Countries count it in different ways. But also there were some KPIs used by, for example, the UK and Australia about text mining of parliamentary records that we're trying to now make also available and spread out to the whole OECD membership. Okay, so again, it's not about coming up with a single number. Who is most corrupt? Is it Denmark? This year, is it Denmark or Sweden? That's interesting and funny for a few seconds for a few journalists, but we don't do that. So it was designed much more to be more granular. So therefore, it's more difficult to navigate. You don't have one number. You have more of a dashboard. What you get on the other hand is that you get a much better view of that there are really different subsystems of what we call a national integrity system. And the performance of these can vary a lot depending on the country. And we can easily see already with the data we have that some countries have really invested in preventing undue influences in lobbying, but they haven't done anything to improve political finance for a long, long time. You know, so these are the kind of different subsystems where we can see some are strong, some are weak, which I think is very useful. Then, of course, always, as the literature will also say, having a good mix of de jure and de facto indicators. That is also a built-in design feature of these. There are not many direct measures of corruption. It's not that we are against it. It's just that, again, that direct measures of corruption for more than one country are really, really scarce. So whenever this is still the holy grail, and whenever that happens, we'll integrate it into the framework. But until we have some good strong measures or direct measures of corruption, we cannot include it in the framework. But we do have a lot of good kind of corruption risk or corruption vulnerability indicators, and focus a lot on balancing, so that it's always limiting just to the core of the de jure indicators and focusing on also measuring de facto. Okay, finally, also learning from the literature, this thing about, on the one hand, not having a single number, that also means that you unpack, and focusing on subsystems also means that you unpack corruption to focus on specific behaviors. And that is where it becomes also actionable, so that you can address directly the lobby authority, you can address directly the election commission, so people actually know where change needs to happen. So it's a dashboard, it's not a ranking. And also where we, as the newcomer, kind of fill a void, I think, is that we have not focused on long narrative reports with many recommendations to country, rather taking a more data-driven approach, which is more focusing on actually getting the data and then publishing it. And then we're hoping that the next step now is more about making the data useful. Okay, I know there's a lot of text on this, so if you paid attention so far, that's already fantastic. This is the most heavy slide. Yes, you can stop me.
May I interrupt with a couple of questions?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Because as you said, there's a lot of background information here, very useful. Could you say something more about the sources of data that you're using for these integrity indicators? Is it original data that your team or the OECD in general is collecting from the member states, or do we also rely on secondary sources of data?
Yeah, so there is no, let's say, shortcuts or proxies in terms of, or secondary data sources. So it's all primary data, and of course that's a big concept. So to give you some examples, even if there is a checklist, let's say the simplest indicator, which is not new in that sense. So how strong is the regulatory framework for political finance? That there are many indicators out there already that have this kind of thing. I think one is that our checklist is quite, I heard from other people, it's quite nice. It's very concrete in terms of what countries, this is the minimum, let's say 10 criteria that a lobby legislation needs to fulfill. And it's grounded again in what was already agreed by member countries. And then we insist on actually always linking back to the paragraph of the law. So we get directly the lobbying law, and we send it back to the country for validation. Even if we have lawyers on our team, you can never be fully into every single legislation in every single country. And I think even that step is again, it's very basic social science. It's a very basic process feature, but we're actually the only one that actually give the evaluee a chance to correct some factual things. It's not about opinions. It's not about whether, I believe this or I believe that. If you go back to the criteria, they're formulated. So we're trying not to discuss with countries. We're trying to be very kind of factual. Do you allow anonymous donations or not? But of course, if you've tried to get your hands dirty, you will know that it's a lot about the finer details of the law. So you will need to go deeper and actually analyze. And this is where I really think that this validation process is super useful, because it might be in a completely different set of regulations that you have, the safeguards that you want to find, and not in the actual primary law, or et cetera, et cetera. So this is the most basic example where at least, we do our homework, we have a database with all the public finance laws of the country, we validate it. Then when it comes to administrative data, it gets more interesting. So here, for example, when it comes to, we have one on submission of conflict of interest declarations. Yeah, so this is actually, we ask for both the data set. They can send us an Excel sheet, they can send us whatever they have, but it needs to be, they don't just give us the percentage and say it's 45%. So we're asking for something that can be validated. We're asking for their, which we don't share, but we get it, we analyze it. We also calculate the numerator, then the denominator to make sure, because these things can be counted in many different ways. So we ensure consistency across countries. So we ensure that it's the right type of declarations that are actually counted. So I think this is as close to primary data as you can get here. So we get actually the submission rate for different type of officials. And in other cases, we go directly to the source. So, for example, we have some quite good and basic indicators on whether different data set, different public registers have different functionalities, whether they're publishing different types of information. And it's actually my team that opens all the websites and checks these functionalities and does that. We have some indicators that rely on data from parliaments. This is often downloadable on the parliamentary website. It takes a bit of effort to find. And this is, again, useful that the countries can actually say, well, you didn't find it. It's a bit difficult to find, but here it is. So we download the data set. We calculate, I'll show you the two rates. One is about extraordinary procedures. One is about how quickly laws are amended. And if it's not publicly available, we contact directly the Parliament's Public Relations Office, which will then send us the data in some cases. In other cases, they do not. But yeah, so, you know, I think it's as primary as it can really be with the level of effort that you can do. And
it's really reassuring. It's really reassuring that you guys are collecting all this data in-house, and of course that you get to interact with the reviewed states, which of course reflect, I mean, the capacity of the OECD, of course, to command that level of collaboration from the other states. And later on, I will have a couple of questions also about anecdotes or experiences from your team about the availability of data because OECD countries are from different regions of the world, right? So I assume that data is more readily available in some cases rather than others. But with your explanation was also, I think, connects very well also with the second question that I had, especially when you started mentioning that you reach out to these member states to ask them for information, which sounds very similar also to the follow-up mechanism of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. So I was wondering, what is the connection, or is there any level of communication between the data that is collected for these indicators and the reports produced for that follow-up mechanism?
There's not. I think it's, again, back to that the OECD has some quite good common methods for how to engage with member countries and ensure that member countries sign off on all types of data. On the Anti-Bribery Convention, it's more of a qualitative approach. So and they're very focused on a specific data set around foreign bribery. So we don't have any direct linkages, at least not yet. We'll see, because the data that we've been using so far has been from, again, I think, other actors within government, the ones I mentioned. But you're right that kind of the OECD just has this inbuilt mechanism, because we use these contacts for other things, for adopting standards, for having a policy forum. So these networks are already established. And there is actually, whenever you adopt a standard, there's an obligation on the country to, after 5 years, report back to the council on the implementation of it. And this is the indicators, basically. So it gives us that hook to say, we need to know. So, and sometimes it's if we don't have, this is often what slows down the process. If you know exactly who the focal point is, Then you get, sometimes they have the data nicely organized, sometimes they do not. But if you know who you need to talk to, this is kind of the most important part of the process. Then everything goes rather smoothly after that. It might be that they don't have the data, but then that's also a finding in itself, and we'll get back to that. You kind of started that. I think this is also a kind of a byproduct of our indicators, is that we're actually mapping which countries are rich on data, which countries are not rich, which is already, I think, very, very valuable. But having that kind of access to primary data is quite unique, not just the published primary data, but actually that data that lies in the administrations and are untapped so far, because it has not been, and sometimes it's not for bad intentions that it has not been published. It might just be for capacity issues. We have a few interns, sometimes we help them, just send us, whatever you have and we'll make sense of it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. No, that is very insightful, because as you mentioned, certainly the indicators, the nature of the indicators is completely different to the reports, which, as you mentioned, they are qualitative, and they also serve for other purposes. But I was assuming that as member states already have kind of that architecture ready to that established focal point to reply to OECD request for information, that potentially your team also was able to build on that, or take advantage of the existence of those channels of communication. Thank you.
Okay. I think this is the last general slide, but again, just to orient yourself a little bit. So when I mentioned the 2017 recommendation, this is the kind of infographic on what it has. It has 13 principles, and this is what we measure against. And then we have a set of tools that help countries implement that recommendation. The indicators are there at the tail end as the evaluation tool, as the dashboard, but just it's nice for you to know that also we wrote a handbook that gives more kind of qualitative guidance with examples that complement all of this. We have a softer version of the indicators, which are these maturity models. It's like a self-assessment tool where countries can just on the internet go and kind of assess themselves. And then we have a kind of online repository, a toolkit. So let's say if the indicators show that France has the best lobby register in the world, unfortunately on the website you don't have the link to the specific lobby register on our portal, but actually that toolkit, the online toolkit, does. So ideally, all of this would be very easy to navigate, but now at least, but it's still a bit separate, but now at least you know what are these different components of it. And then a few more resources, maybe, just for you to be aware of. I want to show you the Data Explorer, which is the main OECD data hub for all OECD data. And it's quite new. We just published all our data there. So far it hasn't been very easy to download and analyze for researchers, but now it is. So I will show you that. I'll also show you an example from the OECD Government at a Glance of how it's still in the early phases, but how we've starting ourselves to analyze some of the data. This is one outlet, the Government at a Glance, and what messages that are there. But also for you, good to know that, let's say, the big publication that will summarize all the findings of this data that we are producing will be in an Outlook that will be launched at the next OECD Global Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum in 2024 in March. So there will be a bigger publication, but so far we've had much more focus on the data generation. And we do have a website, maybe not so much for researchers, maybe more for the general public, but it's still quite maybe fun for you to go and explore. So do you see the Data Explorer now? Yeah. So if you go here, if you go to government, you will find the data set where you can manipulate the data, download the full data set. Yeah, I won't go too much into it now, but it's everything you need to play around. And of course, at some point, there has been actually one blog done on the strategy indicators by our economics colleagues, where they're starting to do some cross tabulations with other sets of data, which I'm sure many people will start doing as this data is now available, which will be quite interesting. So how does this relate to, let's say, experience of bribery in different countries, or whatever other data set that you can find? So that is the website that you need to know. Sorry, now the format of Zoom is just preventing me from clicking on the next tab. So this is the Government at a Glance web page, and this is for the whole directorate. So our data is, as I said, the outlook, the integrity outlook will be the main, let's say, outlet for analyzing the data. But for now, we're publishing in various other outlets. And just going down to, you can see it includes a lot of different public governance areas. But so we are down here. So this is our data here on public integrity, where we started to aggregate a little bit, looking across like de jure, an aggregate composite, and de facto aggregate composite across the three areas. We have more, but we're looking at lobbying, looking at political finance, and conflict of interest here. So this would tally up how strong are lobbying regulations across the whole OECD membership, and how strong are some of the de facto or in practice criteria performing. And one of the main, let's say, findings across the whole OECD is that, lobbying is, as expected, this is a newer area, one of the most underregulated, and also one of the ones where countries in practice have very few tools and do very little to counter. Yeah, but you can go and read in the Government at a Glance the 2 pages that we produced. Then
a question in the chat. I don't know if you would like to take it now or later. It's from Matthew.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't notice.
He's asking how easily are countries providing data, and how many countries have not yet produced to OECD that needed data.
It actually varies across. So far we have 2 large sets of data. We had strategy first, and then we now just concluded a very large one, which is called accountability of public policy making. But that is so big, and it includes lobbying, political finance, conflict of interest, open government, public participation. And within that, even some subsections, country, because again, the election commission might have given us the data, but the lobby authority might not, that we publish what we have, and then we keep following up on the rest. And it moves quite fast. So I think, I'd say 6 months ago, we would have under 30 countries for the data that I just presented, and now it's looking very good. I think we have almost all engaged, not complete, but for the most recent one, close to 35. But there are still pockets where we will keep some of the more difficult indicators, where we will keep pushing. Let's say, I will show you an example later. We have one on, like, say, revolving doors for ministers and public officials. and this is back to our data collection. Kind of one of the things that make us very unique as well is that for some areas we know we cannot rely on central data. So we actually have a mechanism to go and collect data from all ministries, and we take the top 10 largest agencies. So for example, when we want to calculate that revolving door rate, we ask all ministries and the biggest agencies to report to us, and then we calculate the rate of how many left the office within 3 to 5 years to join a lobby organization within their policy area. So I don't have it, because it varies so much. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's getting better and better. And this is part of my job, is to constantly also be in touch with embassies, for example, OECD representations, to keep reminding countries of their obligations. And the more and more momentum we have, the better we are at capturing and keeping these things. I think for the next set that we will launch on internal audit, it will be launched in December, but already now it's getting better and better. So we have around 20 countries already validated. And I would say we have no countries where we have no focal points. And then very excitingly, actually in the future, we will move beyond the 38 member countries. So we will add for sure another 30 countries to the data set. But because it's primary data, because it's real data, it is a bit scattered. It is not that one country provided the data, yes or no, because it's not about asking one person to rank a country, if you understand what I mean.
Yes, thank you. We have a number of questions. Let's start with Lucy, then we move to Alfredo and Victoria. Lucy, would you like to ask your question or make the comment?
Yeah, hi, Jesper. Thank you so much for the great presentation. I'm Lucy Binder from the Basel Institute on Governance. I was really interested to see that you're moving away from this kind of expert-led data source, which I think reflects a move in lots of sectors to move away from expert-led opinion to kind of evidence-based information. But I just wondered, we also in this sector have, like you've highlighted, difficulties in getting data in the first place, and we're sort of behind in a lot of ways in terms of the data that we have available to us. Do you think there's still a place for expert-led opinion to inform decision-making, or do you think we should be doing what these indicators are trying to do and move really away from using that data altogether?
Yeah, I think there is a spot for it. I think it's if that is all you have, it's a problem. And I think, as you say, other areas are much more mature. So if we look at like how we look at the OECD is primarily like the strongest part of OECD relates to economics, right? Economic data. And it's kind of taken for given that we could never do what the economists are doing, but I actually don't agree at all. This is also when you talk about national accounts data, for example, this is also a result of OECD through 20 years actually getting countries to adopt similar definitions and conventions, and then gradually countries start to report in a way that you can use. And I think here we would never then go back to relying on expert-based views, only for these areas where still we don't have any data, but hopefully that should be less and less. So I think it's just a natural evolution. As you say, what can just bother me a little bit is the level of investment in the different. I see many new initiatives being launched, so it's not about. I just don't see much reason to launch new initiatives based on the approach that we've had for the last 10, 20 years. not that we should go away with the old, but if we launch something new, let's do something that actually fills the gap instead of just, now it's really confusing if you look at like corruption indices out there, because they're all really, really similar. Which one should I pick? We actually advise also internally in the OECD, for example, again, our economics colleagues in the economic survey, they have like a section on anti-corruption and public integrity. And we advise, so they come to us, well, which of these should we use? I say, actually, it doesn't matter very much which one you use. But then they say, well, why do they differ so much? I say, I actually have no good answer why one would say that Denmark is slightly better, another would say that Sweden is slightly better. And that's a problem, yeah. So you only need one or two of them. You don't need many more. And then just really that then should invest more in getting the type of data we want. And some countries are starting to do that. So, and kind of realizing that data is a value for national administration. So there are many examples, but let's say Australia, I had some good conversations with Australia where they're just establishing a new anti-corruption authority. But also separately, then the Office of the Prime Minister is launching like an initiative to gather this information from across the different bodies and do that kind of dashboard that we're also trying to do, just in a cross-country perspective. So it is possible, but we've kind of just running around the same mill a little bit, maybe for a long time.
The question, I'm sorry, Lucy, would you like to follow up?
No, that was really helpful. And I did have one more question, but Joseph, I can wait for my turn again.
Oh, okay, sure. Because I see here in the chat that Victoria's question connects very well with Lucy's question. Victoria, I don't know if you would prefer to unmute yourself and ask it directly.
Okay, hi. Jesper, thank you also for a really great overview of this topic. I also am connected to U4, working with GFA Group in Hamburg in Germany, but I also do some work with U4 mostly on justice sector reform, so it's nice to be in touch. Yeah, my question was really thinking about the connection between these indicators and the SDGs, and then thinking about evidence generation and what countries are obliged to, what type of data countries are obliged to collect and publish, so that it makes it easier to compare across countries. But I know it's also really expensive for countries to do this, and this is a big debate with SDGs. Can we, force countries to generate new data collection on particular issues? So really, that's a bit of a broad question, but just asking you, have you come across those arguments as well? Or are you lobbying the governments with whom you work to collect certain types of data that helps you measure these indicators? And then what is the relationship between these and the scattered SDG indicators through the different SDGs?
Thanks, Victoria. And I do remember you was actually also from the U4 days, so good to reconnect. It's a big question, and I will probably need like a long time to really answer it like satisfactorily. Next week, I'm going to Vienna. There's a big global conference there, and we're going to be discussing this again. So maybe tune in Vienna for the larger answer. So maybe for our work, what we do, we of course also try to say, and this is back to the KPI story, is to say, look, the more you can use this OECD data for your own, we do a lot of support on national strategies, for example, national anti-corruption strategies and building M&E frameworks. And the more you can use this data also, the easier it is for us, the easier it is for you. So spreading this across the membership, we already do. There are some differences, right? So we have to produce a framework that is universal, whereas the anti-corruption strategy of Lithuania should be very focused on the problems that are just facing Lithuania. In terms of the like the SDGs and the new UN framework for corruption measurement. Yeah, I think it goes back. So I was part of both the first task force and the second task force. The first task force was about producing a manual to national statistics offices on how to ask the bribery question, so that it can feed directly into the SDGs. I think this was very useful guidance. I think the take-up was not so good. And that should be, let's say, the first step, the lowest step. I think this is actually globally where maybe my answer to Lucy was a bit kind of a downbeat, not so optimistic. But if you want to be optimistic, I think actually in terms of surveys, there's been a lot of innovation like the last 10 years. And we have much more guidance in terms of doing good corruption measurement through different types of surveys. Still, national statistics offices is probably the last bastion, and this is a very long-term process to get them to collect this data. So we don't focus specifically on that. Again, I think the UN is better placed. Also within the OECD, we have the trust survey where this is actually then, I mean, it's our own data, it's OECD data, but we just take the survey data and kind of integrate it into the framework. Otherwise, the difference is, again, that also with the second task force for the UN UNODC task force to measure the SDGs, that it's kind of a catalog for statistics offices that we hope that they will take up. And I think that is really useful and really valuable, but it's difficult. It's very difficult to convince them. And that was a little bit similar to what my early U4 days, kind of producing these catalogs. I don't know if you know, for example, I wrote this How to Monitor and Evaluate Anti-Corruption Agencies. That was very popular because at the end there was an annex, which was a catalog of possible indicators. And people love that, and it's very useful. But still, I think it would be many, many, many years before we would have anything from national statistics offices that we could directly use. So what we're doing is a bit different. So we're actually doing it ourselves. So we are with the countries getting the data directly. So I think this is how it matches. So I think it matches quite well. Then, of course, you can talk about what are good indicators, what are not good indicators. And that is a very long discussion, which we shouldn't have here.
Thank you, Jesper. Alfredo, I'm sorry for making you wait so long. Would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, thank you very much. So can you hear me correctly? Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So my name is Alfredo from the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. And well, it's actually two questions. The first one is if you could talk a little bit more about the value of this dashboard approach versus ranking approach while looking at it at the data. Yeah, it is indeed very difficult to compare countries with each other. Maybe you can compare two at a time, but it is it seems like it wasn't designed for that. Is this correct? And in terms of a composite indicator, is it something that you're aiming to do, or do you think that this would, let's say, add more confusion than clarity? And this is from the perspective of design. And the second one is more related to the choice of the indicators. In your experience or in your perception, is having the evaluees or the member countries being so involved in the provision of data, are there trade-offs here into what you can capture? For example, in terms of one thing that I see lacking here is judicial proceedings or cases that are open, or the rate of inhabilitated public officials. Is this something that let's say maybe countries would be unwilling to share, and therefore it is not considered for the index, or are there maybe reasons along this line? Sorry for the convoluted question. Hopefully, I got the
These
point
are
across.
really good questions. So I'm just gonna, because I didn't take notes. So let me try. And if I have three, you have three questions so far, right? I will start with the last one, and if I don't remember the first two ones, just jump in again. Actually, on judicial proceedings, that is now we're doing internal audit, which let me show you here, kind of like the structure of where we are. So we did strategy first, and we did this big one, which is about lobbying, conflict of interest, political finance, open government. We're finishing this one, which is called risk management, but it's about internal control, internal audit, risk management, corruption risk management. So here we talk to national anti-corruption authorities, Office of Prime Ministers, etc., those kind of overall coordinators. Here, as I said, we talk to Election Commission, lobby authorities, ministries of justice, or whoever is in charge of these different policy areas, parliaments. Here, it's very much ministries of finance. So within the ministries of finance, there's often a central harmonization unit that handles these kind of internal control, internal audit issues. And actually, enforcement is then the one we want to launch this year. And we will see how far we get and whether we can release some data for the next Global Anti-Corruption Integrity Forum in 2024. And this is where some of these indicators that you mentioned would fit, about like calculated disposition time, about clearance rate in courts. Yeah, some of the judicial data would fit there. So I don't, and actually this is quite a well-structured, at least in the European context, which I know best, it's quite a well-structured data set where we wouldn't be like inventing anything really. There's the CEPA data, which is quite nice and comprehensive. So I find that not too difficult. I think the kind of trajectory of some of them is a bit difficult. So some of the other examples that you mentioned, whether they show whether this is good or bad, I think is a bit difficult. Some of them, there's some good effectiveness measures. How effective are courts? How efficient are they? And then I think you can come up with some good criteria around, you know, how do courts have some anti-corruption safeguards in place, which is quite important. But some of the other ones are a bit contextual. Anyway, this is kind of for the future. Now I already lost my chain of thought. So what were the two other questions?
Well, it was about the dashboard approach versus the ranking approach,
yeah.
And whether you're thinking of implementing a composite index once you have all of these, let's say, I think 8 dimensions set.
Yeah. So again, we kind of turned everything upside down compared to other things. So most other people, when they start out, they start by saying, I want an index. And then they try to find whatever is there to stuff into that index. And then it ends up just being as good as possible. And we did it the other way. So we started from saying, what would be interesting data? We will structure it at a level of aggregation that we can stand by and make sense. So of course there is some aggregation. It just doesn't end in one number. This is already aggregated at this level. If we go to this one, if we click, we have a set of 16 like small composites. Some of them are numerical rates, like this one. Others are like a checklist of regulations or practice-oriented indicators. If I click here, it's a little checklist, or it's like a simple composite. I can see here that individual criteria. This is not such a good way to show it, but you get the point. And I think even nicer is then, if you go to the country pages, this dashboard approach, yeah, where you can say, okay, well, we don't provide one number, so if I want to look at this one, which are, and if you move all the way to the bottom, which were the most negative differences compared to the OECD average, which ones are the most positive differences to the OECD average, which ones are the highest performer, which one are the lowest performers. Yeah, so it just requires a little bit more navigation to look into it. And you could easily do an index on the basis of this. If we were to do it, I would probably copy, I don't know if you know the Better Life Index from the OECD, which I think is a really, which is, I think is a really nice index because it allows the user to set the weights. Because this is the problem often when you design this, then you have to kind of arbitrarily set the weights between the different components. And actually here, you can see how much the overall score varies depending on how much weight you put at the different components. And you can see how countries are kind of changing, not in terms of the data and how they're performing, just in terms of how the composite is designed. And we already have a few examples where external actors, or even some internal within the OECD, are starting to do mini composites out of our data. I think it was also about the conversation with the delegates, about the national counterparts, about what type of information they wanted. And again, there was no need for another mega high-level index. There was a need to be able to, from a grant perspective, say, yeah, we need to strengthen our political finance. Well, regulation looks good, but it's the practice that's missing. And actually, the lobby part looks quite good. So I think we will aggregate more as we move forward, but I will hope that we will stand our ground and kind of force people to, again, maybe back to the economics data example, where people have been trained a bit more to understand that these are separate indicators, and you could mix up inflation rate with foreign direct investment and other things and come up with some kind of weird composite, but you should really be looking at these measures individually, and then even you can have some expert assessment of which one do I weigh more in this particular time and point for this particular context. So that's the philosophy, yeah. And then your second question was what?
I mean, I think it's answered already. It was just the cheeky question on whether there is a value on having a large, say, ranking measurement, or if this is something that you specifically wanted to avoid, just because, you know, corruption is such a highly politically salient topic that I was wondering if there was some unease against having that, or it was more about the presentation of the data. But I think that's already answered.
We will see whether, because I think one of the things we're fighting a bit against is that because people are so used to the one number from the existing indices, I don't know whether it's going to be too difficult to kind of maneuver this kind of dashboard approach. And again, I think maybe this is one of the disadvantages in our area of, let's say, the early indices being so popular that people got very used to seeing information in that way. But I hope that we will keep this, and I don't think we need to come up with much more aggregation, I hope.
If I may add also something to that respect, I get the impression from previous roundtables as well that there seems to be ample support for having this level of data disaggregated. instead, as you mentioned, just having the one number. This may be my own preference, coming as bias as well. Right now, I'm going through the process of reviewing the past meeting reports. But for what I remember, every time that the presenter suggested or showed some level of disaggregation similar to the one you're presenting here, people seem very much on board with that. So I think that, especially because many people are interested in this data in order to inform policymaking, certainly that one number is not something that people can do much with, right? As we are now well into discussing the indicators, I was wondering if you would say something about the process of moving from operationalizing the standards that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation into these number of indicators, because there seems to be a large number of them. And as you well know, the devil is in the detail, and very often the way in which we word the questions, or specifically the way that we measure certain things, have a big impact in the outcome, right? So I was wondering if there was if all these indicators were largely uncontroversial, if they are based on previous research or previous indexes, or were some indicators kind of more innovative, or there were more debate about them compared to others?
Yeah, good question. Let me see if this slide helps a little bit. So you need a frame to construct, your indicators, and I think it made sense for us to start from the OECD's own frame, as I said. So that's why we have 6 sets. It relates to 6 principles. So actually we have some principles that are not either yet covered or maybe not very measurable. So it's still not like a complete framework. So when we talk about, like, for example, government commitment, which is one principle, but how do you actually measure that, and how do you? It could be an interesting challenge. But the ones that we chose are mainly in this part. So the more practice-oriented ones. And then we said, okay, we have to kind of lean on what OECD countries consider best practice, but still we have to have like a nice mix. And maybe this is what this shows, of not too much that focuses on regulations, because this is the green one here.
Could you put it in full screen, please?
Yeah. So this is kind of one way of looking at the build of it. So people tend to, when they design indicators, it's much easier to come up with criteria for the regulations. So it ends up being very overloaded on those. So it's a bit like the Danish dogma movies. I don't know if you know them, but we had some internal rules for kind of setting limits for ourselves in terms of what. So we said, we only want one mini composite per area in terms of regulations, and we should limit the number of criteria ideally to 10. So we only focus on, let's say, the really crucial ones, because you can easily mushroom for all of these areas. So these are the green ones, and as I said, they're not very kind of innovative in that sense. There's a lot of other indicators out there, but we do actually specifically link it back to the texts adopted by the countries, and that is new. But otherwise, they're still controversial in that sense that some were like typically these normative texts are also made a bit vague and ambitious at times to ensure that countries will adopt them, whereas indicators cannot be. So we actually have to kind of really pinpoint actual behaviors. So what we tried to say is that we would have always kind of one or two that would really push for some more frontier actions by countries. So, for example, when it comes to lobby regulations, even if it's not explicit in the actual recommendation, it is in the handbook, which is like the commentary to the recommendation. Even if it's not explicit that there should be a ban on lobbyists entering government. So many countries have a ban on the reverse. So government officials entering into lobby positions. It's kind of but it's a new thing for many OECD countries to also put a ban on lobbyists entering government. We only currently have 2 member countries that are doing that. Still, it was agreed within the task force, and OECD Secretariat was also pushing that would be one of the things that we need, kind of a nice mix of criteria that are the basic ones, but also a few ones that would actually give some room to progress. Yeah, that you would see countries could actually improve. Even the good ones are not perfect. So maybe that's an example of working with the recommendation. And actually, you have to be just much more specific when you develop these criteria. Then the purple ones are those that are not based on regulations, but based on actual practice. So as I said, for example, use of conflict prevention, number 6, use of conflict of interest prevention. This is where we count the actual submission, the actual systems for registering the interest declarations. The number 8 is where we look at whether they have a lobby register, whether they actually have the basic functionalities of the lobby register, whether it's publicly available. Then 9 to 14 are numerical rates. So they're still practice oriented, but they're not a checklist. They actually come out with a number at the end. Number 9 is just a simple count of a predefined list of data sets that we want to see publicly available. This is a very simple one, but then we have some more innovative and advanced ones. We count the number of draft laws sent for public consultation. We count the laws amended within 1 year of adoption. The use of extraordinary procedures is one of my personal kind of nice favorites. That says a lot about this, kind of one of the key performance indicators for parliaments. And as I mentioned, the revolving doors one is probably the most heavy, because this is very rarely centralized information. So we actually look at the information from every single ministry and get them to report against this. And then the last ones are say they're not secondary data sources, but it's not us implementing them. These are the trust data, trust in parliament, trust in government.
So number 9 through 14, you say they are numerical, right? So you basically count them. So I assume then they need to be standardized to be comparable across countries. Do you convert them into an ordinal rank? How do you assess if, for example, the number of draft laws that you're seeing in one country is a large number, is a small number?
Well, I think the percentage transformation for us does that. So we don't normalize, we actually present the raw rates. If a big country or a country with a lot of legislative activity produces 400 laws, another country produces 100 laws, I still think in the end, that rate should be close to 100 of draft laws that are sent for public consultation. So I don't think that's a particular problem, because you take the numerator and the denominator. Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the things that we're going to try and look at also. I think one of the things that will be interesting for future research, whether it's done by us or others, is much more about different types of governance contexts. So, for example, presidential systems versus non-presidential systems. I do think there is a difference here. And this is probably where you need still some expert knowledge to interpret truly the data. Is that simply just some countries, they don't have that practice, in this case, public consultation, because it's done in other ways, because it's a presidential system, or there are many laws that bypass parliament, for example, because it's a presidential system. So I think you will never truly produce an indicator that doesn't require that kind of interpretation.
Fair enough. That's certainly the case. Thank you.
So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I'm sorry for asking so much. I see that we're already running close to the 90 minutes point. I don't know if you still have more of the presentation that you wanted to share, or we should just open the floor completely.
Well, I wanted to show you those videos, but maybe you can just go on YouTube yourself, and you basically just type public integrity indicators. Then you have a few videos popping up. I think those that I would look at that actually present the data. Some of them are more kind of generic, but those are the ones on political finance, conflict of interest, and lobbying. I think these were quite nice. They don't include some of the more fancy examples that I mentioned, just because thematically, maybe presentationally, we don't know yet where to fit them in, like the legislative data or the revolving doors data. But still, I think it will be good. And until the outlook comes out, you can look at the government at a glance chapters that we produced, which is also kind of a packaging of the data. Yeah, otherwise,
sounds good.
Some very good questions.
We are going to include then the links to the YouTube videos on the report meeting, so that everybody have the chance to look at them. So then we can just open the floor for the last few questions. We still have around 5 minutes. If no one is ready to go ahead, I guess I can ask something concerning the future of these public integrity indicators. Could you say something about, I don't know if you're already planning to have kind of like a once a year process of reviewing the indicators to see if more indicators should be included or change in the way they're worded or the data calculated. Because that usually speaks a lot to the sustainability, not just of the collection of data, but also in the capacity of the users to compare the data from on a year-to-year basis, right? So could you say something about that?
Yeah, no, so definitely, I think also we wanted and are trying to build them to present a time series, because that's also usually the problem with new initiatives. They're born and then they fade away and you don't have a good time series. It's always, and I've experienced that with my other work as well, where we're just revising the whole indicator set. It's always a challenge, because sometimes you do also need to update your indicators. Some norms, they fade out, other indicators turned out not to work. We don't have a once a year, we do it after each, because we work in waves. So after each main wave, we take stock, and you can only really get to that point after 6 months, a year after the completion, when you've done the full analysis. I think in any case, we might weed out a bit. We have a lot of data. It's already very big, and we're not even kind of complete. We have 8,225 data points, and we're kind of halfway into the cycle. And then keeping that still aiming at the comparability is difficult. As I said, now we have a new lobbying recommendation coming out. We don't have much on lobbying, even if I gave all the examples. Actually, it's a bit funny. We don't have a lot on lobbying right now, and this is something where the OECD wants to add a lot more. But I'm hoping to keep the ones we have constant, and then kind of adding new ones if we find some good new ones to add.
So that means that the data set that is currently in the website, we should expect some updates coming up at some point.
Yeah, so we're currently updating the one on strategy, for example. So we would push out a new, so we have the 20 2021 data published, but we're updating that. So we hope to get a new wave out by the end of the year. So that should be for all of them, that not every year, I think that's too heavy, but every 2-3 years we would hope to do the updates. And then hopefully those updates will be a lot less work than, let's say, the baseline that we've set the first time around, because now we know where to go, we know what the original legislation is, we know where the conflict of interest registers are, but we'll see. Yeah, it might still be a lot of work.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of work. I was actually, while you were explaining about the indicators, I was wondering how large is your team, because I know firsthand how difficult it is to collect original data, and then to process it is quite challenging. So I imagine you guys have been probably knee deep in data for a significant amount of time already.
Yeah, in OECD terms, it's a quite big team already, and then we will need to expand also, given that we will add more countries. So that's also a challenge like this. Let's say if you want to produce this type of data, you need hands on deck, and unfortunately there are no AI tools that will do it for you yet. I'm 100% convinced. But then hopefully it will be good. Yeah, so we need to always make the case that this actually adds value, the big investment here.
Sounds good. Already the tool that you have been showing us today look quite impressive, and I'm a really big fan about this capacity of look at the data in a disaggregated form, because I feel that it really has a higher impact for policymakers and hopefully researchers as well. So I'm looking forward. I'll be looking forward to seeing how academias will respond to your data set. So thank you very much, Jesper, for a wonderful presentation. Very, very insightful. I know that the OECD will also be supporting the conference that is taking place at IACA next week, as you mentioned before, August 31st and September 1st, the Global Conference on Harnessing Data to Improve Corruption Measurement. So that should be very exciting. And I look forward also to the presentation then.
Sounds good. Really good questions today. So have a good day, everyone.
You too, Jesper. Everyone, thank you very much. Hope to see you all next month.